Hey everyone, my name is Dr. John Tam, and I'm passionate about sharing about social science with everyone. I'm a career coach, and I also have a YouTube channel called Dr. John Tam, so definitely go check it out if you're not watching it on there right now. Today's video is in partnership with Prezi, and so I'm going to be using Prezi technology to present my topic, which is unconscious bias. And so without further ado, let's get started. So, unconscious bias, what is it? Where does it come from? Before we get anywhere, let's talk about the neuroscience and the psychology behind it. And we can get a best understanding of unconscious bias through Daniel Kahneman's work called Thinking Fast and Slow. This is probably his most famous book, and this guy also won a Nobel for his research. And what unconscious bias is, according to Thinking Fast and Slow, is that our brains can generally be split into two regions. One region is called the conscious brain, which is what we call the slow brain, hence the turtle over here. And there's also the fast brain, which is what we call the subconscious brain, which is kind of like the hair at the bottom. And the reason why we have two parts of the brain is because back in the caveman days, we really needed to have a fast response. If there was a threat, if there was a predator, we need to respond immediately. We couldn't just wait, right? And so hence that's the fight, flight, or freeze response that we often have. On the other hand, we also have a more logical brain, and the conscious brain, that's where language is stored, that's where culture is stored, that's where logic is stored, for the most part, broadly speaking. And so the conscious brain and the subconscious brain interact with one another in that we first have that initial response based on our subconscious brain's reaction, and then it is followed by our conscious brain's reaction. So essentially, we have a system one, which is our intuition, our instinct, which consists of, some people say, 95% of the brain, right? Which is the unconscious, fast associative autopilot brain that we have. So sometimes when you're driving along the road, you go from point A to point B. For the most part, you do not remember all the little details of what happened in between because your brain was pretty much on autopilot. On the other hand, if we force ourselves to memorize a second language, we are really tapping into our rational thinking, our system number two, which consists of about 5% of our brain. And that takes effort. It's slow, it's logical. It's somewhat lazy, and hence you need to really put in a lot of effort and coffee to get it moving. And it's somewhat indecisive as well. And so when you tap into your second language, for example, if you speak French, in Canada, we speak French as sort of our second language. Some places they speak French. What happens is that if you speak it for a long time, you start getting tired because you're not actually using it from your fast brain. You're using it from your slow brain. And hence, it's very taxing. But essentially, that's how our brains work. There's a fast system and there's a slow system. So what does that mean? Well, that means that when we first see someone and we have that initial stereotype, that is essentially our fast brain taking action. We could also have our slow brain take action, but it kicks in, by definition, slower. I threw this out on LinkedIn. I asked everyone, hey, what are some common stereotypes that you've seen people have on you? And on the side here, I have a bunch of screenshots of what people responded, right? So you can see there are a whole bunch of stereotypes that people have for white people, for Vietnamese people, for Latinos or Latinas, for East Asians, for all types of people, there are different stereotypes. I'm not going to read them all. You can definitely pause it and check it out if you want. But essentially, when we're talking about the fast brain, then that is the implicit bias. That is the unconscious bias. Most people use them synonymously, and that's what kicks in. So how do we rein in the fast brain? Well, we have to tap into the slow brain. And through that process, though, before we talk about how to tap into the slow brain, a lot of times people say, hey, the IAT test by Harvard is the gold standard for figuring out what the fast brain does, right? And the IAT test is the implicit association test. And essentially, it is a fast, quick trigger reaction, which basically times how fast you respond to certain images and prompts. And based on those responses, they determine whether you lean towards a certain bias or other, right? And you can easily, just Google it, Harvard Implicit Association Test, and you'll see this window over here. feel free to go take a test. And, well, pause this video and go take it. I'm not going anywhere, right? But essentially, that's what people usually say is the proof that implicit bias exists. And yes, it does prove that implicit bias exists. However, it doesn't prove that it's effective. And this is what a lot of meta-analyses of the literature has said. This is what the creators of the IAT from Harvard have said, that essentially over time they found that the racial bias test in particular, right? So there's a lot of different, if you look at the previous slide, there's a lot of different types of tests here. The racial one in particular is not exactly reliable. It's 0.44. In social science, anything above 0.7 would be considered reliable. But 0.44 is hardly reliable, right? It's pretty far from reliable. And so that's important to take note. Is yes, we kind of proved that implicit bias exists, but the test and retest reliability, which is essentially you take a test 1 month, on day 0, and then 1 month from now you take the test again, you don't get the same result, right? And hence that shows it's not exactly consistent. The other proof that we have in terms of this test is the validity, right? We found that through 4 meta-analyses of the IAT, they found that it's generally a weak predictor for discriminating behavior. And it's not surprising because based on what we discussed earlier in terms of the fast brain and the slow brain, the slow brain will come in and rein in a lot of discriminating behavior. People realize that, hey, wait a second, that's kind of a stereotype. And so sometimes they can pull it back and stop it, right? Other times, especially when you're under the influence of alcohol, when you're really tired, when you're really emotional or heated, then that's when the implicit bias, the unconscious bias reigns its ugly head. And that's where, a lot of unfortunate things happen. So this IAT, it's only good for understanding implicit attitudes, but it's not necessarily good for understanding behavior. So what can be done then, right? Now that we know and we understand the science behind this, what can we do about the unconscious bias? Well, essentially, I love James Clear's book on atomic habits, right? It actually talks about the science of the fast brain and slow brain and what are the things that we can do to intervene and stop the fast brain from making mistakes, and how do we leverage a slow brain to intervene with us going on cruise control and perhaps making mistakes that we may regret. And essentially there are 3 things that you can do. Step number 1 is identify the patterns that show up. Number 2, it's to slow down. Number 3 is to make a change. And what does that mean? Well, in step 1, what are the ways of identifying patterns? You identify the patterns where autopilot things exist, right? When you automatically, there are times when there's a time of day where you tend to be a little more tired and you enter into a state of autopilot. There are certain persons who you respond to in a certain way, and you need to intervene that with your slow brain. It's like, hey, wait a second, this is not particularly right. There are certain places where we may tend to get relaxed. So, for example, in happy hour, at a bar, or whatnot. And then there are certain situations, such as getting heated in a boardroom argument or a team meeting. These are situations where these patterns may exist. The step number 2 is you need to slow it down then, right? So that you really think whether you want to take that action or not. So, for example, one thing that you can do is avoid those situations, right? So avoiding is a very good way to avoid those behaviors. Another one is the 5-second rule, which is you extend it for 5 seconds before reacting, right? When there's a certain situation that hits you, you take 5 seconds. Take a pause, count to 5, and figure out, is my reaction justified or not? Is it discriminatory or not, right? Am I gonna do something that I'm gonna regret? And essentially, rein that in. And finally, the third thing is to ask questions. Instead of being reactive, ask questions and seek to understand. Is there something that I'm not understanding here? Is there more to the story? And particularly, the best questions to ask are actually the what questions and the how questions, right? I generally recommend people to avoid why questions, because why questions can be, it's like, why? Why are you like this? And that could be quite, it puts people in a defensive position. What and how is more like factual. It's like, hey, what's going on here? What am I missing? How are we doing this? How does this work? And that's it's much more easily explained. And so slowing things down to really allow that slow brain to work, to rein in the fast brain, is essential. And finally, we also have to look for opportunities to change when it is warranted. So making connections with people. And one way is if there's a certain person in your office who you have these certain biases towards, right? And you're able to catch yourself, right? Because we've done step one, we're able to identify it. Then the next step is to really reach out and make that human connection. And once you make that human connection, you realize that, hey, wait a second, most of the time people don't really actually fit. They're not perfect. They don't perfectly fit certain biases, right? And sometimes they don't fit at all, and sometimes they fit parts of it, right? So really reach out, make that connection, and see that person as an individual rather than seeing them as a part of a larger group of people who you'd easily brand in a certain way. You can also undergo coaching, and you can also connect with mentors who can point you in different directions so that you can see different perspectives. And there's also different activities that you can do, such as introspection, such as meditation, journaling. These are all really good. And perhaps soft skills training, such as better communication, addressing the fast brain so that slow brain can do its work, right? And so once again, what we can do is to identify patterns, to slow down, and to really make the change. I'd like to thank you for watching this video. If you want to learn more, then definitely connect with me on LinkedIn. You can also check out my YouTube channel, Dr. John Tam, or check out my website at drjohntam.com. Have a great one.